Hello, everybody. My name is Kingsley Abbot, and I am the Director of Global Accountability and International Justice at the International Commission of Jurists. And it gives me real pleasure to join you all today at this launch of our new guide, Access to Justice for Unlawful Deaths and Enforced Disappearances, a guide for human rights defenders. And it's going to be produced in Spanish and English, at least initially. Before I talk about the new guide, I wanted to talk a little bit about impunity, the global problem that this guide seeks to address. As many of you know, all over the world, we continue to witness serious human rights violations taking place with impunity, including extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. States which have the obligation to conduct investigations that comply with international law and standards either fail to do so, or the investigations are inadequate in some way. And likewise regarding prosecutions, either they do not happen, or if they do, they take place in trials that lack independence and impartiality, and sentences are handed out at the conclusion of those trials which are inadequate. And these are just some of the challenges that victims and their families confront. And the patterns are often similar. In my role at the ICJ, I work on access to justice for serious human rights violations all over the world. And I often think about how predictably similar each situation is, whether we're looking at Cambodia or the Gambia or Venezuela. The source of impunity is often the same. It's often a lack of investigations, a failure to prosecute, immunity or amnesty laws that protect the powerful or the wealthy and the influential, a lack of independence and impartiality in the justice sector, and the criminalization of the very work that human rights defenders do, just to name a few. And that's why when we witness victims coming together, victims from all over the world, despite the barriers that they may have, cultural barriers or language barriers, they often find a lot of common ground because they realize that they already know and understand each other's situations and struggles. And as we all know, the work of human rights defenders and victims representatives is extremely difficult. But even though it's very difficult, over the years, the international human rights architecture has strengthened, and human rights defenders and victims now have an enormous collection of shared experiences and shared information. Things such as strategies that have worked, campaigns that have had results, and advocacy that has brought about change. And just as governments look for new ways to commit violations with impunity, the work of human rights defenders has also adapted and changed with the times. And so it is important that we, from time to time, sit and record some of these lessons for everybody involved in the struggle for accountability to use. And that is really why we produced this guide for human rights defenders. It's for human rights defenders working on accountability for serious human rights violations, to make the relevant international human rights legal framework more accessible, and to provide practical guidance based on lessons other human rights defenders have learned in their work from around the world. And so these two areas constitute the two different parts to the guide, part 1 and part 2. The first is really looking at the applicable law and standards, and the second is looking at practical advice. And the guide draws on a number of different sources of international laws, all the way from treaties and declaratory instruments to regional jurisprudence. One of the standards that really pays close attention to, because it's so relevant to the guide, is the revised Minnesota Protocol on the investigation of potentially unlawful death 2016. And I'll pause here just to say a few words about the revised Minnesota Protocol, because it features in quite a few parts of the guide. Well, back in the 1980s, a small group of Minnesota lawyers were concerned about the lack of accountability for numerous suspected unlawful deaths happening around the world, in particular political assassinations. And their work resulted in the Principles on the Effective Prevention and Investigation of Extralegal, Arbitrary and Summary Executions, 1989, which was endorsed by the UN General Assembly. But then later, they thought what was really needed was some practical guidance on how to implement and monitor the implementation of those principles. So in 1991, those Minnesota lawyers and a range of experts produced a manual to guide the implementation of those principles called the Minnesota Protocol. But the old Minnesota Protocol from 1991 over time was considered a little outdated because it was drafted before DNA technology and digital photography had advanced to where it has today. And also there have been some significant advances or developments in international human rights law. It was also considered a little incomplete because it had a real focus on commissions of inquiry, for example, as a primary accountability mechanism, and didn't so much emphasize other avenues. So a detailed process of revision was undertaken and completed in 2016, and the revised Minnesota Protocol was launched in 2016. And it is now, well, really continues to be an important source of standards and practical guidance for those conducting investigations of unlawful killings, including extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearance. And also for those monitoring them, like victims, human rights defenders, lawyers, the media, and others. And it contains the relevant law and standards for investigating unlawful deaths and enforced disappearances, and how to practically conduct an investigation, covering in the practical section areas such as managing a crime scene, conducting an autopsy, how to conduct a witness interview, and so on. But this guide that we are launching today also draws on a number of other secondary sources, including some other practitioners' guides of the International Commission of Jurists, including Practitioners Guide number 2 on remedies and reparations, number 7 on impunity, numbers 9 and 10 on enforced disappearances and extrajudicial executions, and number 14 on the investigation and prosecution of potentially unlawful deaths. And all of these are available on the ICJ's website, www.icj.org. So let's conclude by spending a few minutes looking at the guide that we are launching today in a little bit more detail. Like I said earlier, it is divided into 2 parts. The first part covers the applicable law and standards. It looks at the definition of unlawful deaths under international human rights law and the definition of enforced disappearance. It then goes on to look at international humanitarian law and international crimes, and also looks at crimes against humanity and genocide and their relevance to the issues covered in the guide. It then moves on to talk a little bit about the international obligations of states, because here where we are talking about the rights that people have not to be subjected to enforced disappearance, not to be subjected to extrajudicial killings, we then have corresponding duties and obligations that the state has to provide remedies, reparations, to conduct investigations and prosecutions, and so on. And this is all set out in part 1 and of the guide. And there's also a special focus on the rights of victims, including their right to justice, truth, and reparation, the right to access information, and also the protection of victims and witnesses. Now, part 2 is a more practical section of the guide. because it really attempts to pull together some of the experiences that human rights defenders have from around the world working on these issues. It begins by really defining what a human rights defender is and what the role of a human rights defender is. It then looks at deciding whether to launch a campaign to monitor, document, and report on the violation of human rights, and looks at how to manage a campaign, examples of campaigns, and how they impact on justice, reparations, and truth. It also sets out a roadmap for seeking justice in the event of an enforced disappearance or an unlawful death. So if you are working on human rights in your country and you receive news of a potential enforced disappearance or an unlawful death, like an extrajudicial execution, like what do you do? What are some of the first steps that you take? And it looks at things that can be taken, or steps that can be taken at the national level, but also at the international level and the regional levels, including looking at the Latin American, African, and European systems, and also the International Criminal Court. Lastly, it also looks at one of the important tools that human rights defenders have working on these issues, which is strategic litigation. It begins by defining what strategic litigation is, and looks for the criteria for deciding whether to strategically litigate a case, such as the objective you are trying to reach, the time considerations, the issues of financing, looking at the wishes of victims and respondents, and provide some examples of strategic litigation. So to conclude, we really hope that you will find this guide useful in the work that you are doing. And we hope that if you have any questions about the guide or any queries, you will reach out and won't hesitate to get in touch with one of us at the International Commission of Jurists. Thank you.